What on earth was the Reformation, and how does it affect us today?
The Reformation was a huge seismic change in ideas where people felt, not for the first time, but for the first time in that generation, that they could think things through themselves, that they didn't listen to or need to listen to priests, they didn't need to accept orthodoxies, and that they could find their own way to salvation, which is how they understood what was going to come after death, but also how they would live in this life. So it is a radical breaking with traditional ideas about authority and about how you find meaning.
Let's lay this out for everyone, including myself, that has no idea. I mean, the Reformation happens some point between the Battle of Hastings and World War II. That's as far as most people's knowledge go. And it seems to be a period, especially in my generation, that's just not discussed when it is so important. So when is this, and what are the key factors that kick this all off?
So this is in the 16th century, so the 1500s, and it starts with Martin Luther in 1517 pinning his 95 thesis on a church door in Wittenberg. That's perhaps what happened. We don't actually know whether he did pin this document on this church door, but this is the idea. So Luther is a monk, and he is somebody who is an intellectual, and he has decided that the way that the church does things is not quite right. And among the things that he objects to is something called indulgences. And indulgences is a practice by which a person who's a believer can buy their way out of some time in purgatory. So this idea exists that after you die, you'll go to a place of limbo between heaven and hell. And there you will work off, you will do penance for the things you've done wrong in your life. And you'll make your way to heaven. But you'll do that through pain. And that could be for 10,000 years. And this is a 13th century idea. It's not in the Bible. But this idea comes about that an indulgence means you can buy time off that pain, and you can buy an indulgence for your loved ones. So your mother has died, your grandmother has died, you don't want her to be going through these years of suffering, and so you will do something to purchase this indulgence. And Luther thinks this is complete nonsense. And when he challenges this idea, to cut a long story short, it challenges the sort of real authority of the church. And eventually he comes to believe that the Pope who is saying these things are true must be fallible. He must be able to make mistakes, which is not something the Catholic Church believes. And it kind of kickstarts this revolution in ideas. So it starts people thinking about what is true and what can you believe and whose authority do you need to accept. And then people start to theorize about that in different ways.
I want us to get this in early because someone listening at home might go, it revolutionizes this idea of thinking about what's actually true. But we're 1,500 years after Christ at this point. Come on, guys. Come on, humanity. We've had 1,500 years to think about what's true since Christ was alive, and we haven't. One of the limiting factors is the speed of communication here. Let's talk about the printing press. How does this impact the Reformation?
I don't think that people haven't thought about what was true in 1,500 years, but they have reached different conclusions about it. And yet you're absolutely right that technology is key to this change. So the printing press is only 50-something years old at this point in time. And up until this point, it's basically acted like a really quick way of making a handwritten book. But now it's started to use to disseminate ideas. So one of the ways Luther becomes so popular so quickly is that he's having these pamphlets produced, which are cheap as well. So people can afford them. Not loads of people can't read, by the way, but that isn't a real obstacle because as long as you know someone who can read, like today, you just need to know someone who can drive and you can get places, right? So if you know someone who can read, they read it out loud and people know the ideas.
What's the ballpark of how many people can actually read at this point? Is it a class thing? Is it some people went down different paths? They wanted to be farmers, but they did have access even at a lower class if they chose to read. How many people are reading?
10% of men, 5% of women can read by the beginning of the 16th century. And it's generally speaking, they've not really had any education at all. It's really hard to know because we chart literacy by who could sign their names. And like judging by my child, you learn to write your name pretty early before you can read a book. So they might have had really basic literacy. And quite a lot of people are still just signing with a mark. So who can read? I don't know. It's a very small percentage of people.
I'm happy for us to jump about a little bit here because I think there are so many interesting points to bring up early on. We've got the printing press, and it feeds into something I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is communication nowadays. We can all read and write, almost all of us. I think it's like 99.9% in most Western countries now. But the way that we have variation nowadays is through things like podcasts versus TikToks versus people who do still read and write. Actually now, reading and writing isn't the new thing. It's the old thing. It's a closed book, literally, right? And the thing that's fascinated me, even though I was about 5 years old when it all kicked off, is the new atheist movement that happened in sort of the early 2000s to 2010s, and how TV panels and debates impacted the level of depth of discussion, especially with a topic like Christianity, where it's probably not going to work just going on a GB News panel or a BBC Newsnight panel and fleshing out some talking points that you've said a million times, not going into deeper depth. That kind of is antithetical to what faith and religion is, right? But what you see with the new atheist movement is this unique prevalence of exactly that, these on-stage debates that sometimes run for a couple of hours and go into more depth. But the thing that's the biggest variable there is the power of the orator and how skilled they are at oration rather than philosophy or theology, right? Mm-hmm. So it's so cool to see back in the 1500s, the limiting factor is reading and writing. And now it's the opposite. Now we have an abundance of technology and we're kind of frying our dopamine systems, trying to get shorter and shorter clips out to stimulate the viewer. And now we've almost had a regression back to surface level discussions because our technology is too powerful. I mean, you must see this a lot when you're studying history as a historian. The technology massively changes everything.
Yes, and actually, if we're thinking about the 16th century, there are two things that I think relate to the way we communicate today that are the same, and one that's quite different. One is that although there's all this printing, they're not just printing words, they're printing pictures. And quite a lot of those are vividly coloured. And so the pictures communicate to those who can't read. And so you've got Luther depicting the Pope as, as a monster or as a kind of creature of Babylon, and these ideas that are conveyed through pictures. So that's our memes or images today. And then also there's a lot of oration. So once we start to have what kind of become the painfully carved out categories of Protestant and Catholic from one church, we have preachers who can preach with extraordinary oratory skill. And they preach for hours. That's the bit that's different. People will listen to them for hours. I guess it's a bit like going to the cinema or going to the theatre. I think for people at the time, this is their entertainment. There are plays, of course, but a really good and brothels.
Yes,
should you say? Yes, that's a different sort of entertainment. If they're looking for intellectual stimulus,
right,
they might go to listen to a celebrity preacher who's in town. Mm. So, and they put up with that for hours. But I guess a really good, engaging speaker is someone you can listen to for a while. And perhaps we've slightly lost the art of oratory today.
There's this fascinating concept of how microphones specifically reduce speaking ability. Because back in the 50s, you'd have to record your songs as an artist on these awful microphones that couldn't really pick you up. So you'd really have to vary your intonation, how loudly you were speaking. Whereas now, we've got two amazing Shure SM7B microphones in front of our faces, and this is going to all get run through AI and sound perfect regardless, even if a fire engine goes off in the background. And you can get lazy. You don't have to vary your intonation. So again, it's technology and the development of it actually impeding on humanity and what it means to be an interesting human with proper ideas and skills.
Yes, I suppose like a typewriter, you needed to be able to write your thoughts out pretty perfectly the first time. Whereas now, with a word processor, you can just change it around all the time. You can move your text around. People wrote notes by hand, but then again, that's another form of technology. When I was teaching in universities, I would always encourage my students to write notes longhand unless they really needed a screen for, a reason of accessibility, because you process your thoughts differently when you write them out. It's not just sound waves. You kind of have to place it in your own words and you write it down. And then you would type something from that. But I'm sure it's different when you write, I don't know, an essay by hand than when you type it. And if you type it on a typewriter, that's different from typing on a computer where you don't have to get it right.
I'm always so grateful to be having these conversations. And I say this to my friends too, even when we're just having dinner and having a chat, because there's something so magical in conversation. And you see this in someone like Plato fleshing out philosophy. It's always via a dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain forms of thinking about things and writing about things and discussing things that you can't get in any other way. There's no other proxy to unlock that way of thinking. So it's so important to speak to people instead of just text them on Snapchat, right? Or send pictures with a short caption, because you look at something like philosophy papers where it is a dialogue. It's so much more substantive. And I don't quite know why that is. It's maybe just something in human nature.
I think it's because when you have a photograph with a text caption, what you're doing is you're seeing a reflection of yourself. You've got your own reading of that. You've put your own spin on those 5 words, which it could be completely different from what the person sending it meant. But when you're in conversation, you're forced to engage with the other person's perspective. And of course, we've got all this other information. That's the thing we learned during COVID, is that if you speak through screens, you get a tiny fraction of information. And it's not just that you know how tall the other person is, but you also, we're reading each other's body language just as much as we're having a conversation. So you pick up on a whole level of information that you can't put into 5 words text.
Yeah, but I think a man can smell a lady's t-shirt and guess how close to being maximum fertility she is or something.
And a woman can tell with a man's pheromones, again from the smell, apparently, whether they would have functioning babies or not.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
We've already talking about fertility.
So Martin Luther.
Yeah.
What impact does he actually have? Does he just fade away into history after this 95 thesis gets pinned up on the church?
No, absolutely not. So he becomes one of the foremost intellectuals of the age because he takes on the Pope, and he refuses to accept being silenced when he's excommunicated by the church, even though this puts him in severe personal danger. And his ideas are ones that unfold and become very important to new thinkers coming up. So there are people like John Calvin, Zwingli, who take on Luther's ideas and develop them in various ways. And there are people who go really radical with them. So some of those ideas are beyond the pale from the almost like 90% of the population in Europe at the time. Like, people believe in baptism of infants, but there are Anabaptists who believe that you should only be able to decide whether you are baptized as an adult or not. This is an idea which might seem pretty arbitrary, but is about freedom of choice. And yet for people at the time, because it takes children outside the protection that baptism is thought to offer, at the time it's thought if a child dies without being baptized, it will never go to heaven. It will float in limbo. It will possibly go to hell. This idea is radical. There are people who are saying that women can preach, which is radical at the time. And so there's this big discussion about what's acceptable and what's not. And one of the things that the debate comes down to is about the nature of the sacrament, which is the bread and wine in the Mass or the Eucharist or the Communion. And this can seem so alien to us because it's something that seems, I mean, does it matter whether it's really Christ's body and blood or just bread and wine? And at the time, it's a life and death issue. But it symbolizes the fundamental kind of disagreement that people are having, which is about what really matters. So Catholics continue to believe that the blood and body of Jesus are present, physically present in the bread and the wine, whereas those others believe that it's present, but it remains bread and wine. And others believe it's a symbol. But in Henry VIII's England, for example, in the 1530s, to believe that the bread and wine are merely a symbol of Christ's body and blood is heresy that will lead to you being burnt at the stake. So these things which seem to us so arcane were life and death issues. And we have to try and think about why that is.
How do we get from Luther to the biggest change happening in England, kicking everything off properly? Henry VIII. Let's talk about him.
It's a slightly convoluted journey because in England, the Reformation doesn't happen because of a great upswell of Protestant belief. Protestant are what Luther's followers become called. Protestant because they had protested. It's an insult, like most titles. But there are a few pockets of that kind of belief in London and Cambridge and some of the cities. But actually what happens in England is a kind of top-down imposition. So Henry VIII is married to Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Isabel of Castile, Fernando of Aragon, the Spanish princess. They are very happily married at first, but over time they have this heartbreaking series of miscarriages and stillbirths, infant mortalities. In fact, I'm not sure if miscarriages is accurate. I think it's mainly child death, either in utero or just after. One daughter survives. And by the 1520s, Henry, who's pretty chauvinistic, has decided that his daughter cannot inherit his throne. He needs a male heir. And then in the mid-1520s, he falls in love with a woman at the court, Anne Boleyn.
How did they meet?
How did they meet? She was in the service of his wife. She was one of Catherine of Aragon's ladies in waiting. Henry's unusual in this period of time for a monarch because he likes to pick his spouses among people he knows. So he knew Catherine of Aragon because she was his brother's wife.
How is that alien to usual? It's usually maybe more arranged marriage going across the pond somewhere to another high-up royal family.
Yeah, there's another moment later in the 1530s when Henry is wifeless and looking for another wife, and he wants to meet the princesses of France. It's been suggested they might be a good match for him. And he says, well, why don't they go to Calais, which is an English territory at the time, and he can meet them there and he can pick one.
It's like a 16th century Tinder.
Yeah, exactly. Well, speed dating, perhaps. And the French ambassador at the time is so horrified by this suggestion that the princesses of France should be paraded before the King of England like horses, that he says, perhaps your majesty wants to mount them as well. I mean, he's absolutely horrified. But Henry, the only time when marriage really goes wrong is with Anne of Cleves, when he hasn't met her before. He's just seen her picture, like Tinder. And that goes wrong. That date does not work out.
You got catfished.
Yeah, that's right. So in practice, with Anne Boleyn, he knows her at the court, and she's come from France. She's more French than English. She's cosmopolitan, and she's brilliant. She's one of the most brilliant women at court. And he falls in love with her. And the story goes that they don't consummate their relationship. Either she refuses or they both decide against it. And he wants to marry her, and he wants to marry her and have a male heir with her. And Catherine won't bow out gracefully because she knows that she is really married to this man. And she is stubborn as a mule because she's right. And in the end, Henry tries to find a way to get out of the marriage. First of all, he looks to have his marriage to Catherine annulled, which the Pope would have to grant. And this happens from time to time. Royal marriages are annulled. People say, oh, well, it never really happened. That's an annulment. It never occurred. You were never actually married. And that's happened with the King of France, Louis XII, for example. But the problem is, at the time, the Pope has just been this is 1527, he's just been captured. Rome has been captured by Charles V, who's the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and he is Catherine of Aragon's nephew. And so he is not about to allow his aunt to be besmirched by the dishonor of a divorce. We say divorce. Divorce just means a separation. It's not like divorce as we think of it today. And so the Pope can't act. So he can't grant the annulment. So he puts it off and he tries to lead Henry down another path. The long story short is that the annulment is not granted and Henry has to look for another way of doing it. And in the end, he has to break with the Roman Catholic Church. He has to separate out the church in England from the Roman Catholic Church so that his Archbishop of Canterbury can say he has an annulment. And then he's free to marry.
He's an innovator. Nowadays, he would be an early AI adopter, creating new large language models on ChatGPT or something.
Maybe, but only if it really benefited him. I mean, he's an innovator so far as it fulfills his own selfish desires.
So he's massively constrained by the religion that's hovering over all of Western civilization at this point. And
by massively constrained, we mean he cannot shag the woman he wants to shag, like to be really accurate about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that obviously shows that religion plays a massive role in governing the everyday lives of the populations, even the untouchables that have the divine right to be a king. They still have to play ball to a certain extent. So we know this, but I want us to go into that in more depth because I think this is so alien to someone, and especially me, thinking and looking back at the 16th century and seeing people governed as a society by religion. Some people speak about now, someone like Tom Holland and Dominion speaking about how we have all these fundamental Judeo-Christian values that govern our morality nowadays. But that's a more covert thing. Whereas now in the 16th century, it seems more overt.
I'd argue that maybe not covert, maybe it's internalized.
What's the difference?
Well, because one suggests a secret agenda, whereas internalized means that it's already kind of part of our formation, which perhaps is what Tom Holland was getting at.
It's the air we breathe.
It's the air we breathe, and it was the air they breathed in the 16th century. So it's part of the warp and weave of their everyday lives. I mean, there were different expectations. It was expected that everyone would go to church every Sunday. And in the late 16th century, you can be fined for not going to church. Because it suggests that you're a Catholic as opposed to a proper upstanding member of the Anglican Church. But I think the ways it's affecting people is it's shaping what they think their final destination is, and it's shaping the rhythm of their days and their months. So it's the rhythm of the year is the church year, the calendar of the church year.
Talk to me more about that. How does that impact things?
Well, so all of the events, so we're coming up to St. Michaelmas, which will be harvest. So there's the great festival of St. Michaelmas, which coincides with the harvest. And this is, so most people are agricultural. Again, maybe 5% of people live in cities at this time. And even if you live in a city, you might well work in the fields as well. So the rhythm of the seasons affects everything you do. And that has been tied up with the saints' days over the 1500 years since the birth of Christ. And so the saints' days are high points or holy days of the calendar where you can celebrate some great achievement that's occurred in terms of the rhythm of the year. And so, or St. Lucia, the day of where we now talk about the winter solstice, where you celebrate light at the time where there's the most darkness in the Northern Hemisphere. So there is this sense that the church year gives you holidays. It punctuates the year with fun and festivity. It creates these moments of safety valve where people can run riot, whether that's at Christmas time. There's something called the Abbot of Misrule, where a boy will pretend to be an abbot and will tell everybody what to do. Or that happens just around Shrove Tuesday as well, just before Lent. And the world turns upside down briefly in order to then be able to reassert the dominant hierarchy. So I think that it's really hard to examine your present age and figure out what the water is in which we swim. We can point to the 16th century and say, look, that's the water they're swimming in. Couldn't they see it? And it's like, no, well, when you're a fish in the water, you can't tell it's water. So it's hard for us to know what are all the ways in which we are shaped right now. And I long to be 50 years in the future and look back and say, oh, look, these were the things that they didn't even know that they were doing, or they didn't even think about that idea. How obvious. Why did they not think about it?
It's fascinating, that idea of rest and organized breaks essentially in society, because we often look back on peasants working in fields and we pity them, and rightly so, tough jobs. But something that we do miss out in our historical framing a lot of the time, I think, is that lack of ability to see how it is today and realize how bloody busy we are today, always, compared to actually how busy someone was in the 16th century. They probably had slightly more free time. I don't know, you tell me. But I spoke to Abbot Christopher Jamieson about this, who's a Benedictine monk, and he's written a whole book about how everyone always says, oh yeah, I'm busy, when they're asked, how are you? And he always responds, I'm sorry to hear that. And it kind of catches them off guard, because people are so perennially used to being busy nowadays, and they see it as a duty and as proof, as evidence that they're working hard and they're doing the right thing. So that must affect everything, just having more time to ruminate and question if there is a man in the sky.
Yes, it's interesting how we've valorized the expression I'm busy, haven't we? I think that people worked very hard, and that a lot of that was physical labor. But I think it had a completely different feeling about it. I'm sure that there were implications for women and domestic violence and all sorts of things, but a lot of the work is from the household. So a house could be a workshop if you're living in a city, and women are very involved in the work just as much as men. Or you're going out to do things. There are times of the year, there are seasons, harvest, everybody pitches in, everybody's busy. But then there are times of the year where there's not that much to do and you can sit around a bit. They followed the rhythm of the year in terms of the light as well. So in the medieval period, actually the hours of the day were not set at 60 minutes long. They varied depending on how many hours there were and of light in the day. So the hours were variable. And in the winter, candles are expensive. People have tallow candles generally rather than wax candles because they can't afford wax.
What's tallow?
Tallow's animal fat.
Okay.
It's not that pleasant, and it doesn't produce quite as much light, and it smells, and it's expensive still, so people are not staying up, so they're going to bed. One great debate, I find this fascinating, one great debate among historians has been about the nature of sleep at this time, because it's said that people slept in 2 shifts. So they'd go to bed when it got dark, and then they'd wake up. There'd be a pause in the middle of the night where they would get up and write a letter or pray or have sex, and then they would go back and have a second shift of sleep. But they would have a lot more sleep than us in winter, for example, but then a lot less probably less in summer because they're making the most of the hours. But I love that seasonality of it. I think part of the problem we have now is that there is no seasonality. It's just on all the time, and electric light and our ability to communicate. You can email from your phone. There's never a stop point to your work. When we had a power cut quite recently and we had to use candles and it lasted all night, it was kind of amazing. Try it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. I've done a few trips to Saudi Arabia doing some videography work. And when I'm there, you're obviously immersed in this culture, literally in the middle of the desert where I was, away from a big city and lights and light pollution covering the stars. And first of all, just seeing stars for the first time in like 2 years was crazy. But then tying into that point on sleeping, especially in Islamic culture, their sleeping hours are completely messed up. Like, I don't know how they function, and it's so impressive. But they stay up late culturally. You'll see, if you're in a shopping mall or if you're on a street or a market, you'll see all of these toddlers running around at 11 p.m. casually. And that's just the norm there. But then also, you have to wake up for morning prayer, right? So
But they must sleep during the day, the children especially.
But they don't. They're working. Like, I don't know when they sleep. I literally don't know. That's one of life's biggest unanswered questions for me. So hopefully this podcast will help me answer it. But yeah, these Christians, they have a completely different sleep schedule. They're certainly not optimizing their sleep, although it seems like maybe they slept better than us, even without mouth strips and nose strips.
Yes. I don't know. Not many people have recorded their sleep diary. We don't have like quality of sleep 3 stars, 90%, 69%, or whatever. But I think that they were sleeping more generally, unless they were wealthy, because they couldn't afford not to. They couldn't afford to stay up.
What do you mean?
Well, if you can't afford candles, then you can't afford to stay awake. So you go to sleep. I mean, what else is there to do? You can't. You need a candle to do anything. So you sleep. Or maybe that's why they had so many children.
Yeah. So interesting. Okay, so Henry VIII.
Yeah.
He wants this divorce, and he actually wants a proper separation, not just one of these small fob-offs. Or is that maybe what he has to do?
He wants to have a legitimate child with Anne Boleyn, a legitimate male heir, which means he has to be legitimately married to her. And therefore, he has to have it declared that his first marriage was not a marriage, which means that he draws on this idea that Catherine was not a virgin when she came to him because she'd been married to his brother, and that according to the word of God, by Henry VIII's own interpretation, a man cannot marry his brother's widow. Now, there are verses in Leviticus that rule that out. There's a verse in Deuteronomy that says you must marry your brother's widow, but he ignores that. And the verses in Leviticus that say you must not marry your brother's widow say that if you do, you will be childless. And Robert Wakefield, who's the leading teacher of Hebrew at the time, conveniently translates childless to means you will have no sons. And so even though they have a daughter, it can be indication of God's disfavor with Henry for marrying his brother's widow, and therefore this marriage is against the law of God, and he must be freed from it.
How often does this sort of mental gymnastic of interpreting the Bible to best fit you happen? I mean, you have these indulgences. Why did they happen in the first place?
Well, that's a really good question. It's about the power of the church, I suppose. There are quite a few things. I mean, I mentioned purgatory earlier, and that gets codified in 1275, I think it is. But before that, it had been a popular idea, and the church adopts it. So sometimes it's a response to popular feeling, to what the public believe. I think that Henry VIII's mental gymnastics are particularly unusual, and people at the time can see the problems with them. They can point out the flaws, but Henry is really attached to them because he's come up with it himself and it gives him the result he wants. So he pursues that means of trying to get a divorce. In fact, there probably were some other things he could have done under canon law, and I shan't go into them, but ways in which he could have more legitimately got himself out of the marriage to Catherine, perhaps. But he is a man who has great capacity for self-delusion, as so many of us do. There's this wonderful book I read years ago called Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me, which is about cognitive dissonance and our ability to tell ourselves that we've done the right thing at all times, no matter what. And Henry was a really good example of that.
How do we get from horny Henry wanting to get his way to the Church of England?
So in order to be freed from Catherine, he has to be established as essentially Pope in England, supreme head of the Church of England, supreme head not only of the secular, the temporal nature of society, but also of its religious nature. And that means that he is, in the end, the arbiter. He is the one who can say what is right and wrong. He comes up with the first doctrinal statement of the Church of England himself in 1536. He writes, these are the things that you should believe, because that power has now been vested in him by the Reformation. So that's the creation of the Church of England. And then over the 16th century, there's a lot of change. His son, Edward, is a child when he comes to the throne. His advisors are radically Protestant, and they have this kind of iconoclastic period of smashing things and statues and getting rid of stained glass. And his daughter Mary then turns the clock back towards Catholicism, and then his final daughter Elizabeth institutes a form of the Anglican Church that we now have, more or less. But that's a broad, sweeping overview.
We've got a few key players here. How much of this change is Henry having absolute power? He's got the divine right of kings going in his favour. And how much is it him actually being fairly smart and seizing a unique moment in history?
I mean, I think it can be both. I mean, he's getting what he wants, which involves a certain degree of being smart. But he's absolutely drawing on his power. I mean, Henry doubles down on his power. He uses his rights as a king in various ways. So he starts to use, in the 1530s, something called an Act of Attainder, which is when you pass an act through Parliament, a statute that declares somebody guilty of treason. And of course, up until this point, you can take someone to trial and find them guilty of treason. But the beauty of an Act of Attainder is that you don't need to go through the trial process. You can declare them guilty of treason, and you can therefore convict them by Act of Parliament. And he does this to quite a number of his enemies, because strangely enough, breaking with the Roman Catholic Church produces lots of enemies. He's in a period where he's insecure and paranoid, but as they say, that doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And so he establishes his power and starts to use it more forcibly. In 1539, there's an act passed through Parliament which says that king's proclamations have the same power as an act of Parliament. And so there's been lots of debates among historians about whether Henry VIII was a tyrant or not. And one of the arguments against him being a tyrant is, but he uses Parliament. But he uses Parliament to enforce his will. So another act, I'm just bombarding you with dates and acts, but there's another act which makes treason by words illegal. So it becomes treason, i.e. you will be hung, drawn and quartered for calling the king a schismatic, which he obviously is, calling him an infidel, calling him a tyrant. Is there anything more tyrannical than making it illegal to call someone a tyrant? And it also says that if you imagine the death of the king in words, you have committed treason. So you, even that's thought, basically. Words and thought become treasonous under Henry. So this is a kind of, if he could, it would be like thought police. He doesn't have the power, he doesn't have a police force, but he's trying to impose his will on the people.
They didn't have Douglas Murray railing for freedom of speech at that point.
No.
Let's go down a little diversion and rabbit hole here.
Okay.
Speak to me more about the punishment faced back then, being hung, drawn and quartered. It fascinates me, and it must play into the psyche here as a population, along with all the other factors that we've been outlining. I suppose the way to frame it is that you've got the carrot and the stick. The carrot is religion. And at the same time, unlike now, you've got a much harsher stick with punishment.
Yes. So people generally would only be punished with being hung, drawn and quartered for treason. So that is something against the king, against the government, though definitions of treason are expanding, as I say, in this period. But being hung, drawn and quartered means you have been hanged, half hanged, so you're not dead, you're just suffocated, I guess, to an extent. And then whilst you're still alive, the executioner opens your body, takes out your innards, takes out your heart. If you're a man, cuts off your genitals. Tends to happen. This doesn't tend to happen to women anyway. And then quartered means that your four limbs will be cut off, and your head. I mean, obviously, at some point in this process, you have died. And then the limbs often are displayed in places. So when the Abbot of Glastonbury is hung, drawn and quartered on the Tor at Glastonbury, he's an old man.
Glastonbury Festival.
Yeah, Glastonbury Festival, where overlooking the Abbey of Glastonbury. So he was one of the 3 abbots out of about 800 who resisted the dissolution of the monasteries. He's dragged on a hurdle, which is like a wooden, bit like this table, I guess. He's bound to this hurdle behind horses, dragged up to the top of Glastonbury Tor.
And is forced to listen to The Cure headlining.
Yeah. And then after that torture, he is then killed in this barbaric way. And then his legs are put above various gates, Ilchester, Wells, Bath, various places, so that people will know that you have to obey the king. But the punishment for heresy is burning. So this really takes place under Mary the First, who is Henry's daughter. She returns the English church to Rome, so it's Roman Catholic again, and she has 284 Protestants burnt at the stake in her 5-year reign because they believe in mainstream Protestantism and refuse to conform to Catholicism.
Well, before we get to Mary, let's stick on Henry VIII's time span here. You've mentioned that he has a lot of enemies, as he naturally would do, having such a large upheaval. How quickly does the Church of England actually seep into the public consciousness and begin to take real root in our population?
It's hard to know what that would look like. And it's also hard to know how we would find it out, because the point we were making earlier about the lack of literacy means we don't have that many sources about what ordinary people believe or think or, their interiority. I mean, even Anne Boleyn, we only have 7 letters that she wrote, but loads for Catherine of Aragon, but we've only got 7. These are people about whom it's really hard to find out what they thought and felt. So we tend to get snippets of it when people do something that's considered to be wrong. So because of that Treasons Act, which makes words illegal, we have cases where somebody will say something like, Anne Boleyn's a goggle-eyed whore, which is one woman says, and we know that because somebody else reported her saying it in a pub or a tavern, and so there's probably a personal vendetta there, and then it becomes before the law courts. So we get moments where people do something they're not supposed to do or say something they're not supposed to say, and then that comes before the courts. But in terms of actually accessing what people thought or felt, it's much harder. I guess we get it at big moments like 1536 is a huge rebellion. It's called the Pilgrimage of Grace. And somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. At the time, the population of England is about 2 million.
And this is 2 years after the Church of England's been established.
Essentially, yes, after Henry's become supreme head of the church. They rise up in protest against the dissolution of the monasteries, which is the shutting down of all the monasteries, nunneries, convents, abbeys in the country. And one of the reasons they do that is, according to somebody who's arrested and speaks, or words that are overheard, a guy called John Hallam, he says that because the abbeys were put down, everyone believed all the rumours they'd heard about other things that were going to happen. So there were rumours about taxes being put on chickens, taxes being put on weddings, closing down churches, basically the intervention of the state into local life that people objected to. And they thought this was going to happen because they'd seen the abbeys closed down. So what they wanted was to resist that. But how much they're resisting the religious agenda that they think is being pushed on them, and how much they're saying, bugger off out of our local area and, don't try and put more taxes on me, it's hard to say.
How does the Church of England change with the death of Henry VIII, and when does that happen?
So he dies in early 1547, and he has maintained a line between Catholicism and Protestantism that's really idiosyncratic. So he tries to steer a course between the two of them. He has his own kind of formation of belief. But when he dies and his son Edward comes to the throne as a 9-year-old, Edward's uncle, his mother's brother, is really in charge of setting the course of policy. And immediately what we find is this really iconoclastic regime. And it's a regime that's enforcing Protestantism violently. So there's whitewashing, there's of walls. So there are beautiful medieval murals that get painted over. There are statues smashed, stained glass windows smashed, because they're all thought to be idolatrous. And so we see this massive change to the kind of the visual experience of church.
Unpick that for me to make it really obvious. What does idolatrous mean, and why is that a bad thing for these guys?
So they think that there should be nothing between a believer and God. So there's been priests. You don't need priests now. You don't need to confess to a priest. You can confess directly to God. There have been saints that you can pray to and ask them to pray for you. Shouldn't be that anymore. You shouldn't be courting, as it were, a saint. You shouldn't be paying attention to relics, which are bits of saints that are left over, like their finger or a cloth that they wore, that people have gone to pray at during pilgrimages. No longer should these things be paid attention. You should be working on your direct relationship with God, and that should be created by reading the Bible, by singing psalms, by something that is unmediated. And so a stained glass window with a picture of a saint, a statue of a saint, a rood screen, which is this beautiful carved wooden screen in a church with statues of saints in them, all these things are a complete distraction, a diversion from the true faith, and actually can lead you woefully astray. That's what it's thought. So these things get destroyed. And the fascinating question here is how much people are going along with this, how much people are convinced in the 1550s that this is the right thing to do. All those people doing the whitewashing, for example, do they do it because they're completely convinced by Protestant belief, or do they do it because they want to earn money for to pay their bills?
Well, this is the big question that I want to put to you, and it's a horrible one to answer, so apologies. But
okay, bring it on.
You often hear this discussion, especially when I speak to Christians, of if something suboptimal happens societally, and it's in relation to someone using Christianity as a vessel for imposing ideas on others, Christians will go, yeah, but that's not what Christianity is about. That was someone who was politically motivated. How often in history and the periods that you're well versed in, which I'm sure are many, not just medieval times, how much of the change made is actually to do with theological claims and genuine belief, and how much is it just political ideology imposed on people for the benefit of one or two or a small handful of individuals?
It's an almost impossible question to answer. I think
sorry.
You know that by asking
Yes.
it. But because of the evidence, and also because we don't ever know the nature of anyone else's motivations. We hardly know the nature of our own motivations. So I suggested that in England, the Reformation is something imposed. And sometimes you can do this. Like, when smoking in restaurants and pubs became illegal, it wasn't that people wanted to stop smoking, it just was imposed on them, and then they couldn't do it anymore. And sometimes we can see the imposition of a law. Here's my favorite fact about the imposition of a law. This is a complete red herring, but the reason that public hanging stopped in England or Britain is not because people thought it was unsavory and it went out of fashion. It's because railways were invented. And so many people flocked to public hangings that it became dangerous. They were so popular that hangings had to be made private. Anyway, but that's the imposition of a law that hanging someone publicly is no longer permitted, and then public attitudes change in response to the law rather than the attitude shaping the law. So what I'm suggesting is that quite often we might see in the period of the Reformation change happen, in England at least, because a law has been passed and then attitudes reflect that over time. And it's also generational, therefore. So when you get to the end of the 16th century, you've got maybe 70 years, like no one alive remembers the late medieval Catholic Church. No one has lived in that. They've all lived in the Church of England. They've grown up in it. That is now the water in which they swim. And so actually, you just have to wait, really. Like, change just takes time. It just takes a few generations and then it's embedded. So it's hard to say to what extent it's theological or it's just temporal.
Henry VIII dies. We've got the Church of England established. How does that impact the rest of Europe?
That's an interesting question. So at the time we have in Europe, I mean, Europe is going through its own upheavals with regards to faith. So, England is not that important in the story of Europe at this time. It's a fairly puny little country, and there are much bigger and more important things happening. So over the succeeding decades, we've got, the wars of religion that will kick off in France from the late 1550s, where, 1572, for example, there's the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which is a huge massacre of Protestants in Paris, 10,000 people executed within a few days. And that's after a decade or so of toleration of Protestants in France. We have kind of similar things going on in the Netherlands about whether Protestants can thrive there or not. We've got the imposition of a kind of new form of Catholicism with the Council of Trent. So there's a lot going on in Europe to do with what one should believe. And the key thing, I suppose, here is that no one at the time thought that toleration was a good thing. Everybody thought that there was one truth. They just disagreed about what that one truth was. And so whether it's Protestants or Catholics in charge, on the whole, they're trying to make other people agree with them or go along with them. And so we see violence, shocking violence against one's neighbours and erstwhile friends happening on the continent. By comparison, what's happening in England is relatively bloodless. Relatively.
Yeah, well, there are estimates of between 7 to 17 million people dying in these religious wars. Seems quite the opposite to this idea of grace and loving your neighbour.
It does, doesn't it, rather? I think it's this point at which truth and grace abut. So whether you have to reach what is true before you can extend grace, I don't know. But I think that's what's happening in the 16th century. It's a massive tussle over what is true.
I guess it speaks to something that everyone grapples with today, which is sort of if the means justify the ends, or if the ends justify the means, rather, that you're going towards this virtuous destination, and that's all that matters. It's for the benefit of others. So you can cut a few corners, tell a few lies, and screw a few people over in the process as a necessity.
Yes, and there are various ideas about this in the 16th century that facilitate that even more. So, for example, as I say, after Edward, we have the backlash of Mary, which is imposing Roman Catholicism again. And one of her bishops writes a series of sermons which explain that if part of the body is diseased, meaning the body of Christ, the country as a whole, then it is kinder to the rest of the body to cut it off. Right? You cut off that limb so that the gangrene doesn't grow over the rest of the body, say, right? That limb just might happen in this case to be a person or a set of people, but their death is considered to be something that is good for the people as a whole. So there are that's just one example of the kind of justifications that are made for violence in the name of producing truth and also peace. Like at the time in 16th century France, during the wars of religion, it is thought that the wrath of God is what is causing this upset, this violence. And so the putting down of the other groups is one way of appeasing God and then producing peace. So that we have to look to some of the ways in which they understand what they're doing as being something that will produce the right outcome.
Well, this is one of my problems with Christianity as someone who's agnostic. They need to come up with a word that's better than agnostic. Someone who's, I'm not a cultural Christian, I would say, not by choice anyway. I'd hate to call myself that, but maybe something along the lines of Christian curious.
I think you're a seeker, whether you're seeking Christianity or you're seeking answers.
I'm seeking bedrock, I think. And the problem that I have with Christianity is biblical interpretations vary across time greatly.
Mm-hmm.
And you see now, you've got this prioritization of truth over grace. And it seems pretty convenient for people that perhaps don't want grace. It's not that they're aware of the importance of grace or that they're aware of the importance of truth over grace. It's perhaps that they just don't want to extend it to others. And this is a big problem because I've asked a few different Christians this, and I still haven't really gotten a satisfactory answer of how you can actually know your interpretation of the Bible to be true, because it fluctuates always. And I think that's what's so helpful about this period specifically, is seeing how much it can fluctuate and what it can lead to. It seems to me like more of the mapping on of logic after you've already made up your mind and you've experienced your emotions, rather than a true source of bedrock for me.
Yes, you won't get a satisfactory answer to that because you know the answer already, which is you can't know. And I think that idea I mentioned earlier about cognitive dissonance is really helpful. I love this idea. So it's the idea that humans don't like to have two ideas in their mind that conflict. Or so we seek to do anything we can to resolve them. So this explains all sorts of things. It explains why you will value being a member of a club more if you've had to go through painful initiation rites to be a member of it, because you can't think, oh, I went through all that pain and it wasn't worth it. You have to assume it was worth it. Or why when you come eventually to buying a house, it doesn't matter whether you choose the house that has the small garden or the big garden, because afterwards you will convince yourself you were right. If you choose the house with the small garden, you will say, oh, the big garden would have been far too much work. And if you choose the house with the large garden, you'll say, oh, the small garden would be far too tiny for us. You always convince yourself that the decision you've made is right. And I think we see this at work a lot in history, in humans. And so my suggestion would be that that's what's happening quite often with those interpretations you're talking about. But also, I think that when we see in the 16th century people using religion to do what they want to do, which is what you've essentially said, that's because religion is the discourse of the day. Today we use politics. What the problem here, fundamentally, that we're wrestling with is the nature of humans.
Well, how do you wrestle with that as a historian?
I mean, well, we behave badly towards each other. Man is a wolf, towards his neighbor. That is who we are, which of course fundamentally takes you back to the question of religion, and then the circle starts again.
What speaks to you personally most from this era?
It's a fascinating question because, of course, I spent my life thinking about this period, and then one doesn't quite know why that is. I mean, I have answers that I would give. I'm going to give you some of my set answers, and I'll try and work out if those are true or not. So I would say that it's the period at which we know what people look like. We start to have the kind of amounts of information. I mentioned the lack of letters in some cases, but we have chronicles and ambassadorial reports, and we can kind of get closer to them. Like, I would hate to be an Anglo-Saxon historian, for example, where you're really working from utter scraps. You've got this tiny piece of stone and you have to, it's a lot of deduction. It's very intelligent, but I quite like having a bit more information. I like the fact that the change that happens is so seismic that it's completely revolutionary, that these tumults matter a lot. But I think what speaks to me actually is what speaks to me from this period as from other periods, which is that I'm always interested in trying to understand why people did what they did and how they felt. Because it's a distance of 500 years, it's very easy to write them off and to think about them as somehow less human than us, more stupid, less rational. And yet everybody was making decisions that they thought were the most rational, most truthful, most sensible at the time. And they felt things. And we don't necessarily know what they felt because we don't have the evidence of that. But we can feel our way into it, I suppose. I guess I'm interested in, to put it in grandiose terms, kind of trying to resurrect the dead, to try and have an emotional encounter with the people who've died 500 years ago.
What are some nice little tips for someone at home who wants to look into history more and perhaps haven't in the past, for them to actually humanize people? Because I find this hard. I mean, you see people in black and white, even in photographs, and it's instantly just 20 times harder to imagine them actually going about their everyday. So what are some small techniques for actually immersing yourself into history more?
That's an interesting question. I think that the stuff of the past helps us do that a bit. So if you can have an encounter with things of the past, objects, clothing. I remember when I tried on 16th century clothing for the first time, the early 16th century, it varies a lot over the period, of course, but and for women, all of the weight of everything they're wearing is on the hips. And when you see women in portraits at the time, their arms are like this, it's because the stitching on their arms means that they literally couldn't put their arms up. And that kind of that embodying of history. And then I think where possible, where you can get at letters or diary entries by the 17th century or reports of what people did, and try and imagine yourself into that space. It's difficult often because you're engaging with language that is unfamiliar. But like Shakespeare, it's just about drenching yourself in it. And then it starts to become clearer and start to try and get at how people feel. But maybe start with the 17th century because people do write things that are more emotional in a way that we can engage with, whereas they're a bit more formal in the 16th century.
What can we draw from this period to actually help us today?
Well, I think we've started to do some of it in this conversation, which is that we've started to point out the ways in which a culture is determined by, these grand ideas, but also by the small actions of individuals, and that you can see them from a distance. And we can start to think about how can we draw out the culture that we live in. I mean, basically, we have to historicize ourselves, I think. We need to think about what period we're in and not take for granted everything that is around us in terms of not just the technology, but also the ideas, because a lot of these are things that we have culturally internalized, but that doesn't mean that they are the only idea that exists or the best. So my sense is that having the perspective of the past allows you to do that. And then also, and this is true of great literature or any kind of study of history, is that we have to think about other people being as real as we are. So my favorite quote is G.M. Trevelyan, who said, "The poetry of history lies in the quasi-miraculous fact that once on this earth, on this familiar spot of ground, lived other men and women, as actual as we are today, thinking their own thoughts, swayed by their own passions, but now all gone as we ourselves shall shortly be gone, like ghosts at cockcrow." And this idea that we vanish one generation after another, but that we each of us have our own thoughts and our own passions, and that other people are as real as we are, is fundamental to engaging with everybody, whether it's the NPCs that you meet in the street or whether it is somebody of a completely different generation or a different culture to you. Like trying to engage with their fundamental reality, I think is crucial.
Do you ever feel like your personal faith gets in the way of the way you look at history?
I think that our personal perspectives get in the way of any attempt to look at history. And that is equally true whether you're a person of faith or a person who's not one of faith. It's also true, coming to it as a man or as a woman, or it's so absolutely the way in which our own blinkers stop us seeing the past clearly is at work, and it's something we're always trying to fight against as historians, to try and see the past on its own terms.
I feel that that's more prevalent than ever. And again, I think it's this thing of mapping on logic to what you already emotionally decided. And it's funny, actually, seeing that comparison of truth being prioritized over grace. I can't think of a better concept than that to sum up what we're going through today. It's always my truth on both sides of the political spectrum, actually, not to diverge too much into politics here, but people often complain about people on the left and progressives having this arbitrary subjectivism of my truth. But I think it's the same for everyone right now. It's just that one side takes this more secular approach where nothing's true, therefore my truth is all that matters. Whereas the others say, there is a truth, it's my truth, and it's the objective truth. And that's what matters more than anything else.
I was reading Farah Dabbawala's new book, or The History of Free Speech, on the way here. And he raises this very interesting point, is looking at the kind of the development of press liberties from the 16th into the 19th, 20th centuries. And he talks about the fact that in the 18th and into the 19th century, there starts to be this sense that press liberty, the freedom of the press, the freedom to write or say what you wanted, was more important than anything else. And that today we often hold on to this idea as well. And yet that means that you're prioritizing freedom over truth or equity or kindness or all manner of other things. And I remember at school, my history teacher talking to me about the fact that there is liberty to do things, liberty to speak freely, for example. And there's also liberty from things. And so there can never be unlimited liberty to do things without that affecting someone else's liberty from things. And so there is this balance to be struck between freedom, truth, equity, kindness, whether that's we're talking about speech and the sharing of ideas or actions. So I think that once you drive any one of those horses too fast, and the others lag behind, that's when things get out of kilter.
You've spoken a lot about this period of time. You've read a lot about it. You've written a lot about it. As a Christian now in the UK, do you ever long for any attributes of the past and Christianity? Now it's a minority religion in the UK. There must be some things that you look at today that are sort of out of line with what you've studied and that you wish were different now.
I mean, I don't really wish for anything of 15th or 16th century Christianity to be manifested now, except perhaps a kind of vigorous engagement with ideas. That's interesting. But generally speaking, I mean, people often ask me which period I would like to live in, and I'm like, very much now, please. Not just because of penicillin and traffic lights. But I don't wish to return to a murderous age. I believe in people being able to arrive at their own conclusions about faith. I'm a person of my own century. So not really, to be honest, Elliot. I think mostly, if anything at all, it would be that it would be sensing the seriousness of the questions of life. And perhaps they were taking some of those questions more seriously in the 16th century.
Well, I think this is exactly the problem. And it's obvious to not want to go back to the 16th century in many ways that are quantifiable. But perhaps when we scratch below the surface a little bit more and we look at the psyche of humans then, maybe in many ways they were more fulfilled, even if they had a threat, a looming threat of being hung, drawn, and quartered if they misspoke or even had bad thoughts that they articulated once in the pub. I think it's so easy to be complacent nowadays when we are so materially prosperous, right? We would want to live now. Of course we would. But that's why I think we've got this unfolding crisis of meaning happening, because we've put the cart before the horse, where we've gone from top down instead of bottom up with what's most important. We haven't got the foundations anymore. We've got all the jazz. We've got all the new iPhones and consumer culture. But I think what we really are lacking, and I say this as an agnostic/atheist, is that deeper search of bedrock, what's true, and is there anything beyond what we're just experiencing and consciously aware of now?
Yes, and fundamentally, that's the question that we all must face. I mean, I think that in some ways today we are overwhelmed by choice, and probably in the 16th century they had far too little choice. They didn't have a choice, generally speaking, about what they were going to do, although obviously we have some people who rise from the absolute bottom of society to become, I don't know, Chancellor of England or a great playwright. But the vast majority of people are set in their position and have to do what their father did, and they don't have the kind of choice we have today to do anything, to be anything, to fall in love with anyone. But I think it is perhaps a truism that when your focus is much more on sufficiency, on having enough rather than having everything, this is an age in which there's the spectre of famine is ever present. There's lots of epidemic disease. Life is very much considered to be short. They remarry as much as we do, but not because of divorce, but because of death. I think that does focus the mind somewhat on what matters. And I think it's absolutely possible to argue that ease does not produce quality of thought.
That presence of death must massively impact a cultural psyche.
I think so, yes. I mean, I was looking at the Ashmolean at some memento mori. People, in fact, I've put a picture of a skull on my Apple Watch as my own little modern memento mori, to try and, because people were acknowledging the presence of death in life, and I think that is, we see that being picked up by people who are writing about finitude today, the fact that we have limits, and we have to recognize those limits in ourselves. 4,000 Weeks, that fabulous book, for example, talks about that. I think there is a sense that recognizing mortality also means accepting things like aging. It's accepting that you can't do everything, that you have one life and you have to make choices. And those choices have implications that you then live with. I think that having death on your mind in a way that we shy away from would have been absolutely terrifying, but it does produce a certain focus, perhaps. I mean, it's really hard not to step into this sort of fallacy of thinking about the past as some sort of golden age, and everybody has always done so. Even Cicero did. So, we've always thought that everything was better before, and that's not obviously the case. But we can look to parts of the past as guidance, I think.
My mantra at the moment is accept that you're limited by your biology. Now you're aware, you're able to do anything. And it's sort of this balance between realizing that you're human and realizing that you're not immortal, but from there on out actually being able to do a lot more than perhaps you could have done pretending that you are immortal. I was in Brazil recently on a little holiday, and I spoke to a friend there who's a local, and she'd been in the favelas. She has loads of friends that live in abject poverty, and she'd also seen the nicer side of Rio de Janeiro, the beaches, Copacabana. And she made this fascinating point that I think sums up all of this quite nicely, and that's the difference between I wish and I could. And the poorest of people in the favelas, they're never really longing for anything beyond seeing that other people have it alien to them and thinking, that's cool. They're wishing for it. And the wishing doesn't include believing that you'll ever have it, I think. That's a distinction I'd make. Whereas with our growing middle class society, who's materially very, very safe, and you know, I mean, it baffles me that nowadays you can get a brand new iPhone, like iPhone 12, which is 4 years old now, 5 years old now, but still incredible, like newer than my phone, for a couple of £100, and you've got access to the world through that. Being middle class in the West, you can do pretty much whatever you want if you work hard enough, I believe. But with that comes the I could, and the awareness of our prosperity, even if perhaps it's not articulated, even if you don't have this active gratitude for everything you have, you do see that you have less limitations than someone in Brazil in a favela. And sometimes with that comes more distress and a prioritization of flashy goods rather than what's important. And this is the big thing that I saw going to the favelas in Brazil, speaking to people, townships in South Africa. Even though the conditions they endure are horrible, they seem to know the right order of where to put things. They do have family, they do have communities, and they do gather in person. Sometimes they don't have any other choice. They can't FaceTime.
I mean, I don't think you're saying this, but I just to put it explicitly, I think we need to be careful that we're not valorizing poverty.
Absolutely not.
But at the same time, I think that we need to distinguish that from the fact that we as a society have got confused about what matters. And I mean, without wishing to sound completely peremptory, because I do this exactly myself, but every time I travel on a tube, I see everybody on their phone, absorbed. And we all know when we're on it, we're doing something really important, like choosing what song we're going to listen to or writing an email or whatever it is. It's vitally important that we do in that second. But then you look down a carriageway and everybody is there, absorbed. And I noticed a little girl on the tube as I was coming in, and how everybody else in the carriage was looking down at their phone. And I was sort of determined not to be, just so that there was one other human face in that carriage that she could find that was looking up and was like looking at the world. But I think that we anesthetize ourselves. I've been experimenting with coming off Instagram. I can still post to it through, you've got third party, but like not actually being on it, so that I have some freedom for my mind, because I realized I was looking at it too much. And of course, the first day or two are an absolute torture, because you're in total withdrawal mode, and you're like, but it's worth doing, I think, for a month every now and then, because it helps you rethink. And, probably actually, I'm a real fan of Carl Newport and all his work on reducing digital minimalism and these things. Not because I do it all the time, but because I think if we do it every now and then, it helps us kind of refresh. I've gone on a long tangent from where you started, but what I think is that we do have a sickness in our society today, and it's a sickness where we are absorbed in ourselves and we walk alongside ourselves. We're constantly introspective. We're constantly focused on the self, and our little phones, our little devices in our pockets help us do that, and they help us not look up and see the world. And I don't know whether that is more easily done if you have less. I suspect it might be, but I think the problem that we need to confront is where we are as a society, and that's a separate question.
So do you think individualism is one of the biggest problems we face today?
Not maybe individualism, certainly selfishness.
Flesh out the difference.
Well, you could make a case that the individualism is about celebrating the individual and understanding recognizing their rights. There certainly could be positives about what it is to celebrate each individual and treat them with equity, for example. Whereas self-absorption or selfishness, which is the outworking of self-absorption, are sort of more fundamental ills, because really in the end there's no benefit to anyone else from that, I don't think. I mean, I think that I'm not suggesting that we should allow concepts of duty to mean that we don't listen to who we are. But I think that I see the fact that we have this kind of sense of putting ourselves at the heart of everything as something that's problematic. We're never going to. I'm not suggesting that we can ever stop it completely, but I think if we can situate ourselves in the world, in communities, in understanding that other people are as real as we are, then that is the beginning of a difference.
Well, I wonder if it's the modern day equivalent of what was going on in the Reformation, where actually we have some form of individualism, at least, from being selfish. It's the justification after. You turn it political after, and you celebrate it, because it's this retreat to the inner citadel and sort of just rationalizing everything after the fact and making yourself feel better about it. And I think one of the things with Instagram, I mean, I did this too, actually. I had it just on browser, so I could check my messages every now and then. But when I'm out and about, I'm completely detached from everything else online. The problem is that everything does feel so important always. And it's so difficult to overcome. I mean, I've thought about this a lot, and I've really analyzed my own behavior when I am doom scrolling on Instagram. And that's probably the biggest thing, is the sense of importance. Yet, if you ask yourself, can I remember the last 3 Instagram reels I watched? The answer is always no. Can I remember what life-changing fact I learnt, or even important message I sent on DMs? Because usually the more substantial conversation happens somewhere else, away from social media, because there's this certain vibe that comes with being on Instagram rather than on WhatsApp. So I think an important framing is just asking yourself, is someone going to die if I don't go on Instagram for 2 days? Am I going to miss something that's important in my life? And you'll 99% of the time find that the answer is no.
But a lot of the reason we are on these things is exactly that fear of missing out. So that's a fundamental fear that drives people to get onto social media, I think, missing out on something important, because it's, it's like playing the slot machines, they say. You never know when your number's going to come up. You don't know where something important is going to be on there. It could be something that was life-changing, it could be an opportunity. Back when Twitter was a nice place, there used to be genuine opportunities and connections that came out of it. And so there was this sense that you couldn't be off it because you might miss out on something. And so I think the fear of missing out is very much a driver with regards to social media. And also because it substitutes that scroll for proper connection. So you cannot notice your own loneliness, or you cannot notice that you haven't connected with friends that mean something to you, because that fills the gaps. It's the noise. They say that it's really important for children to be bored because it fuels their creativity. It's obviously true for adults as well, right? We need to allow time for our brains to work between things, but we don't anymore. And we fill it up with noise, and therefore we don't reflect so much. Yeah.
What do you find yourself most shocked by, looking at what Gen Z are growing up with nowadays as a historian looking through a historical lens and comparing to the past, is there anything that's majorly different that we're experiencing now? Or is it all overhyped? We're caught up in the moment. Actually, what we're experiencing is the same as the rest of time, just with new technology.
I think our conversation suggests that it is the new technology that is the new thing. I mean, I think people have always lamented new technology. That's also worth bearing in mind. But the technology is reshaping our brains, and it's reshaping our modes of engagement and communication, and therefore relationship, and our sense of ourselves and the world and how important we are. So that seems to me fundamentally the challenge, because, we've talked about compassion fatigue, for example, because if you can see, I don't know, someone skimpily dressed, someone making an interesting point about the Roman Empire, and someone saying, please give money to these children who are starving, and you can scroll past, I don't know why I'm scrolling that way because I go this way, scrolling past each of these with exactly the same degree of casualness, then you start to lose part of yourself, don't you? You start to lose part of who you are as a human, I think, because we're no longer engaging with the needs of the world. And I understand that we can't all care about all the needs of all the world, and that's impossible. But that's why we have spheres in which we can care, the natural spheres around us of the people we know or the causes we find out about, the things that touch our hearts. And I think if we're distracted all the time, which is we are, then we don't listen to our hearts. We don't listen to the spirit within us saying, oh, this is something you should care about. Or maybe you should give that person a call because you haven't spoken to them in ages. Or maybe you should arrange to see your aunt. So I feel like we fill up. I speak for myself as much as anyone else. So I don't know if it's a generational thing, as it's certainly a zeitgeist. It's certainly the cultural moment. Perhaps, I don't know, you tell me, have you ever had a moment in your life where you haven't had this distraction? You're trying to be apart from it now. Like I am old enough that I had time when I didn't have a phone. So I had time when to use the email, you had to go into an internet cafe. So my formative years as a teenager were lived without that shape. So I can't tell you exactly because we have different experiences of growing up, but you tell me.
Well, I think I was on the cusp. So I've certainly grown up alongside the iPhone and internet going crazy. But I do remember being a kid, only child, sat at my mum's flat playing with Lego on the floor for hours on end because that was the only thing, or counting pennies, literally, just to keep myself occupied. But as soon as I got into secondary school, everyone's got an iPhone, everyone's got Snapchat, they're always talking. And importantly, you don't have this escape from anything else because you take it back home with you. And it's interesting, I think our orbit of attention has completely flipped. So before, it was a prioritization of things that are close to us in proximity physically, because that's all we knew, right? And now it's evolved to the point where actually the most interesting things are those that are alien to us and furthest away. So we do want to look at an influencer in their mansion in LA. And I don't think an influencer with a mansion in London would have the same effect as most people living here, for example, because it's less alien and foreign and cool and exclusive. And I think with that comes a detachment of morality as a whole, because when you don't see the direct manifestation of how your actions impact the world, you care less. And you see this with someone who would hate to have a little Chinese child there sewing their shirt for them, slaving away hours illegally paid or not paid at all, in the corner of the room, but they order something from Shein every week that arrives on the weekend. And it's a horrible example, but that's genuinely the reality of what we're doing nowadays. And there are a million other examples. And I'm not putting myself on a high horse above anyone else. I do this too all the time. I do things that would impact someone in a way that I would never dream of trying to impact someone if they were close to me and I actually saw them physically. So there's something very unique, I think, about this time and the technology that enables us to have this detachment from reality.
Mm. Yes. I mean, I remember when I was traveling in Egypt with my brother years and years ago, and we were in the desert, and they were going to make supper, which was going to be a goat curry. So someone carried out the goat and then killed it, and then that was what made supper. I was a vegetarian by that point already, but my point is that it suddenly changes your perspective when you see the goat before you have the curry. And I think that exactly what you're saying is that we are able to look away from the consequences of our actions. This is industrialization. This is capitalism. This is the way in which we have the consequences of what we do shielded from us. I was thinking that we ought to make some, try and balance ourselves a little in terms of argument, though. I was thinking more, if you grew up, actually, I think attitudes towards sexuality were very different, say, in the 16th century. But let's say in a period where homosexuality, or the practice of it at least, was illegal, this happens around the world today, but, periods of Western history where that's been the case. Today, if you can find through social media, through the internet, communities of people who look like you, have the same orientations as you do, want the same things that you do, that is facilitated by what the connections we have today. That's a real life connection, a real life perspective, and something that is really important, people's desires, that in the past would not have been facilitated by just what's around you, right? You couldn't necessarily find people who felt as you did, and that matters. So there are we have to acknowledge the good as well as the bad, and finding people who can reflect yourself back is important. But I think that we're grappling with a big problem here, and let's think about how history can help us answer these things. Like what have been the things in the past that have been on this sort of scale of this significance, this sort of change? And we have been thinking about one, which is the printing press suddenly now being able to spread ideas and being able to print things that could be bought cheaply as opposed to great big books that only rich people could afford, and the spread of ideas. And what we recognize from that, and again, in the 17th century, it happens when censorship is reduced for a while during the Civil War, for example, is that we see that the forces that are unleashed, the ideas that come out, loads of them are radical and brilliant and innovative and wonderful, but there are lots of ideas that come out that can't be curtailed. Natalie Haynes says it's Pandora's jar, not Pandora's box. But whatever it is, box or jar, when the stopper is taken off, then who knows what's going to come out into the world? And I think that's where we are now, is we're kind of grappling with, okay, the iPhone took out the stopper. What are all these things that are floating around?
Yeah, I often lambast social media whilst being ever present on it. And it's made my career, being able to do videography and travel the world at such a young age is something that I'm eternally indebted to social media for, being able to reach out to people and actually run the channels that are on these platforms. And I think even just looking at it through an educational lens, the ability to learn so much. We're in the information age now. It's magical, and there's endless good to be taken from that if used appropriately, but there's also endless bad. So if there's one thing I've taken from this conversation, it's that we need more goat curry moments.
Who would have thought that would have been the takeaway.
No, it's been an amazing chat, and I really appreciate your time. So, Suzannah Lipscomb, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find more of your work?
Well, social media, of course. My handle on social media is 16th C for Century Girl, which is holds me hostage to fortune. But anyway, that's where they can find me. And I have a podcast called Not Just the Tudors, where we talk about history. So more historical chat there. And TV. I make things for old-fashioned TV. So the next series that's coming out is on More 4 later in September. And there will be other things later in the year on History Hit.